In one night, a storm killed more people than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Most of the world has never heard its name. This is the Bhola Cyclone. November 12, 1970, East Pakistan, the region that would soon become Bangladesh. Somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people died in a single night. Nobody knows the exact number, because the islands it hit didn't have a reliable census to begin with. It remains, to this day, the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded on Earth. And the storm itself wasn't even the strangest part of this story. What happened in the weeks after this cyclone would do something no storm in history had done before. It would help end an empire. So how does a tropical storm end up starting a war? It started with something as simple as a government staying silent for 10 days. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a single night of wind and water led, step by step, to a war and to the creation of an entirely new country. Stay with this one, because the ending is not where you think it's going. 4 days earlier, on November 8, 1970, a tropical depression formed over the southern Bay of Bengal. At first, it looked unremarkable. The Bay of Bengal produces dozens of these systems every year, but this one kept strengthening as it tracked north, feeding on warm water, and by November 12th, it had grown into a cyclone with core winds of 185 kilometers per hour, about 115 miles an hour, with gusts reaching 240 kilometers per hour, roughly 150 miles an hour. That put it in the range of a Category 3 hurricane on the modern Saffir-Simpson scale, though some researchers classify it even higher. Here's what should have happened next. The Pakistan Meteorological Department, operating under President Yahya Khan's military government, did in fact track the storm. On November 12th, it issued a bulletin calling for danger preparedness in the coastal districts, and as the cyclone closed in, Pakistan radio broadcast what was called a great danger signal. That means a warning existed. On paper, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. In practice, it saved almost no one. Survivors later said the signal meant nothing to them. Most coastal residents had no idea what a numbered danger signal was even supposed to communicate. Radio penetration across the rural Delta Islands was minimal to begin with, and there weren't enough physical cyclone shelters to evacuate into even if people had understood the warning, despite the fact that shelters had been recommended by government reports as far back as 1960, a full decade earlier. So as the evening of November 12th arrived, hundreds of thousands of people on low-lying Delta Islands went to sleep in wooden homes, with a warning broadcasting somewhere on a radio very few of them owned, about a storm most of them didn't understand was already bearing down on them. What happened next would move faster than almost anyone could react to. The cyclone made landfall on the night of November 12th, striking the coast of East Pakistan and India's West Bengal at the mouth of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, one of the largest, lowest, most densely populated river deltas on the planet. Ahead of the storm's eye wall came the part that did almost all of the killing. A storm surge up to 35 feet high. That's a wall of seawater roughly as tall as a 3-story building, pushed inland across islands that in many places sit barely above sea level to begin with. In Tazimuddin, on Bhola Island, the island the storm would end up named for, water rose 6 meters, about 20 feet, in a matter of minutes. Not over an hour. Minutes. That means the surge was moving faster than a person could run to higher ground, even if they knew exactly which direction to run. The journalist M. Abu Taha, who was there that night and later became one of the storm's most cited eyewitnesses, described the floodwaters that swept through towns like Daulatkan, Manpura, Shah Fassan, Lalmohan, and Tazimuddin itself. In his own words, he recalled seeing snakes and humans tangled together in the surge, with the bodies of people and cattle floating away together on the same tide. By morning, the storm had done what wind and water alone rarely do to this scale. It hadn't just damaged a coastline, it had erased entire settlements from it. And the worst part of this story was about to become one that had almost nothing to do with the weather at all. This storm was about to do something no cyclone before it had ever done, and it would happen entirely on land, in the weeks that followed. The scale of what happened on the ground is almost impossible to picture in ordinary terms, so start with one town, Tazimuddin, the thana closest to where the surge hit hardest. Out of a population of roughly 167,000 people, somewhere between 45 and 46% were killed. That's not a rounding error in a report that means roughly 80,000 people, in one administrative area, died in a single night. That's close to the entire population of a small American city, gone between sunset and sunrise, in one town alone. And Tazimuddin was only one of dozens of similarly devastated thanas across the delta. Multiply that pattern across the outlying islands, Bhola itself, Manpura, Shah Fassan, Hatia, and dozens more, and you start to understand how the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. No exact number exists, because there was no reliable census of these delta islands before the storm hit, which is part of why estimates still range from 300,000 on the low end to 500,000 on the high end, more than 50 years later. Abu Taher's account of the aftermath matched what officials found across the region. Bodies of the dead mixed with dead livestock, carried by the same tides that had killed them, with no way for survivors to even begin counting who was missing versus who was gone. In many villages, there was no one left with the authority, or frankly the strength, to keep any kind of record at all. This is the part of the story where most disaster documentaries would end the storm hit. This many people died. Roll credits. But what happened to this region over the next several weeks turned this from a natural disaster into something that would reshape an entire nation's politics. The government's response to a death toll of this size is where this story turns from tragedy into consequence. It took nearly 10 days for the central government, under President Yahya Khan, to formally declare a state of emergency and deploy military units for organized relief. 10 days for a death toll that may have already passed 250,000 people by the time help arrived in any organized way. 11 separate East Pakistani politicians publicly accused the central government of gross neglect, callous indifference, and utter indifference in its response. That's not commentary from outside observers, that's elected officials from the affected region itself, on the record, condemning their own national government. Awami League leader Sheikh Mujibur Rahman went further. He described the scale of the devastation as akin to a Holocaust and called the military-led government's relief response criminal negligence. That kind of language from a major political figure about his own country's government in 1970 was not a small thing to say publicly. That means the anger over this storm wasn't staying contained to disaster relief. It was becoming a referendum on who actually represented East Pakistan's interests, and that referendum was about to happen for real, at the ballot box, in a matter of weeks. Remember the question from the start of this video: how does a storm start a war? This is where it starts. Internationally, the response moved slowly, but did eventually arrive. By early December 1970, nearly $40 million had been raised for relief by the governments of 41 countries, along with various organizations and private donors. But funds and supplies took time to reach the Delta, time that many survivors simply didn't have. Then, only about 4 weeks after the cyclone, Pakistan held its first ever democratic national election. On December 7, 1970, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League campaigned heavily on East Pakistani autonomy and on the government's failure to protect its own people from the storm. The result was a landslide. The Awami League won 160 of 162 seats in East Pakistan, giving it an outright majority in the entire National Assembly. That means a cyclone had, in effect, just decided a national election. A party campaigning explicitly on the government's disaster failure had won more decisively than almost any election in the country's history. And then President Yahya Khan's military government refused to transfer power to the party that had just won that majority. That refusal, layered directly on top of public fury over 10 days of silence after 500,000 deaths, is the exact point where a weather disaster turned into a political one, and a political crisis turned into something far larger. The standoff over that refused election victory escalated into the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971. That war widened into the Indo-Pakistani War of December 1971, and by the end of that year, East Pakistan no longer existed. In its place stood a new, independent nation, Bangladesh. The storm's reach didn't stop there, either. On August 1, 1971, former Beatle George Harrison and sitar player Ravi Shankar organized 2 benefit concerts at Madison Square Garden in New York. The concert for Bangladesh, featuring Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr and Billy Preston. It's widely considered the first major benefit concert of its kind, a format that's been copied for disaster and humanitarian relief ever since. By 1985, revenue from the concert's live album and film had sent an estimated $12 million back to Bangladesh. So trace the full chain, start to finish. A tropical depression forms over the Bay of Bengal. A warning system exists but fails to reach the people who need it. A storm surge taller than a house kills as many as 500,000 people in a single night. A government takes 10 days to respond. A political leader calls it a Holocaust. An election happens, and the party campaigning on that failure wins in a landslide. The government refuses to honor the result. A war follows. A new country is born. And a rock concert, organized by 2 musicians on the other side of the world, becomes the template for how the world responds to humanitarian disasters for decades afterward. All of that traced back to one night, one storm, and one warning signal that almost nobody understood. If a single cyclone can do all of that, it's worth asking what else in history started with a storm nobody remembers the name of. Hit subscribe if you want to find out, because the next one on this channel started just as quietly and ended just as violently.